All right, let's dive in. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're going way back to the roots of early jazz, and, there are these surprising connections to Cuba that a lot of folks might not know about.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much those two musical worlds were connected, back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Yeah, that's what we're going to uncover today, right? Those Cuban influences that shaped this American music.
Absolutely.
So our source material's got all these fascinating details about the scene in Cuba.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the rumba first, right? I mean, that's like this mix of African and Spanish traditions and just super popular back then.
Oh, it was the heart and soul of Cuba, especially for the working class. It was
Legit.
more than just music, it was a way of life.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a celebration, a way to tell stories, a way to connect with your roots.
Yeah, through dance and rhythm, right?
Yeah.
Like it wasn't just about sitting there and listening.
Yeah.
You got to move, got to feel it.
Yeah.
What I find really cool, though, is how resourceful those early rumba musicians were, like using codfish shipping crates for percussion.
Oh, yeah, the bacalao crates.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were the original drum set.
Right, just like the original beatboxing. You know what I mean?
Exactly. They made music with whatever they had.
Yeah, yeah.
And that spirit, that ingenuity, that's a big part of what makes Cuban music so special.
Totally. Okay, so we have these, like, super talented musicians. They're making music with, whatever's around.
Right.
This vibrant rumba scene is happening. And then, boom, our source mentions a wave of migration to New Orleans. So what happened?
Well, you have to remember, slavery was finally abolished in Cuba in 1886.
Okay.
And that led to a lot of Cubans, including musicians, looking for new opportunities.
Yeah.
And New Orleans was a natural destination.
So they brought their music with them.
Of course. They brought the rhythms, the melodies, the instruments, the whole vibe.
It's like a musical melting pot.
Yeah.
New Orleans was already a melting pot of cultures.
Exactly. And Cuban music just added another layer to that rich mix.
Okay, so what specific Cuban music styles made it to New Orleans?
Yeah.
Did any of it influence early jazz?
You bet. One of the biggest exports was the contradanza, also known as the habanera.
The habanera, yeah.
It was a dance rhythm that had already become popular in Europe.
Oh, wow.
And it really resonated with composers in the emerging ragtime and blues scenes in New Orleans.
I see.
You could say it was one of the key ingredients in that early jazz gumbo.
Fascinating. So those Cuban influences were already there right from the start.
Right from the get-go.
Okay, so we've got the rumba, the habanera.
Yeah.
Then our source mentions the Spanish-American War in 1898. How did that change things? I mean, how did that affect the music between those two places?
Well, that's where the story gets a bit more complicated,
Yeah, yeah.
The war and then U.S. interventions in Cuba, it created this really complex political situation.
Yeah.
But even with all that going on, the musical exchange kept going. You had Black American musicians, many of them performing in minstrel shows, traveling to Cuba, and they encountered all these new sounds like the danzón, the son, the guaracha, and of course the rumba, and they were blown away.
It wasn't just Cuban musicians influencing American music.
Oh, not at all.
It was going both ways.
It was a two-way street.
Okay, I like that, yeah.
Musicians were inspiring each other, sharing ideas, creating something new together.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it was a really exciting time.
So I have to ask about this guy, W.C. Handy.
Oh, yeah.
The father of the blues, right?
Yep, the man himself. He was fascinated by Cuban rhythms.
Yeah.
Particularly El Chiquillo Haitiano and La Clave.
La clave, yeah. That's a familiar term.
Oh, it should be. La Clave is like the heartbeat of Cuban music.
Yeah.
And you can hear its influence in so many early jazz tunes.
They're really, like, specific songs.
Absolutely. Think about Louis Armstrong's Tiger Rag, Jelly Roll Morton's New Orleans Joys.
Wow.
Even Handy's own Memphis Blues and St. Louis Blues. Yeah, that unmistakable syncopation, that infectious groove, that's the legacy of La Clave.
It's like the secret code embedded in those classic tunes.
It's like a hidden treasure waiting to be discovered.
That's amazing.
And while Cuban musicians were shaping the sounds of American music, they were also learning from their American counterparts,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Picking up elements of blues, banjo playing, even the foxtrot.
I see.
It was a true exchange of musical ideas, a real back and forth.
Like trading musical secrets.
Exactly.
Adding new spices to their sonic palettes or something. That's so cool.
Yeah.
This connection is way deeper than I imagined.
Oh, there's so much more to uncover.
Okay, so we got the rumba, the habanera, la clave. But what about this tango rhythm that our source talks about? Isn't that more of an Argentine thing?
That's a good point. While the tango is most associated with Argentina,
Right.
it actually has roots in Cuban music too, particularly the habanero we talked about earlier.
Oh.
And Jelly Roll Morton, the jazz piano pioneer, loved the tango. He really helped popularize it in the U.S.
Wow.
It even influenced those stride piano players in New Orleans, St. Louis, and Harlem.
So we're talking about like James P. Johnson,
Yes.
Lucky Roberts,
Too.
Willie the Lion Smith, all those guys.
All of them.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah, it's like this musical chain reaction with influences bouncing back and forth across continents.
It's amazing how connected it all is.
It really is.
Okay, so we've got all these Cuban rhythms and melodies finding their way into jazz. But what about that quote from Chucho Valdés, the Cuban jazz pianist?
Ah, Chucho Valdés, legend. He talked about how there was this amazing back and forth between Havana and New Orleans in the 19th century.
Yeah.
You could hear jazz in Cuba and rumba in New Orleans.
Right.
It was this vibrant musical conversation.
Yeah.
But then in the 20th century, that connection started to fade because of political circumstances, and he really lamented that loss.
That's kind of heartbreaking, especially knowing how much these two musical cultures inspired each other.
It makes you wonder what could have been
Absolutely.
if that musical dialogue had continued.
Yeah.
Who knows what amazing music might have been created?
It's a reminder that music transcends borders and politics.
Exactly.
All right, so we've seen how these Cuban rhythms and melodies made their mark on early jazz. But we're just getting started, right? What else is in store for us in part 2?
Oh, we've only scratched the surface. We're going to dig deeper into specific Cuban musical elements like the cinquillo rhythm and how they became part of the DNA of jazz.
Ooh, I can't wait.
We'll also explore the roles that influential figures like Jelly Roll Morton and James Reese Europe played in bridging those musical worlds.
This could be good.
Get ready for some more surprising revelations.
Yeah, and a deeper appreciation for this, incredible musical tapestry.
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll be right back with part 2 after a short break. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into those Cuban roots of jazz. Last time we uncovered this incredible musical exchange between Cuba and New Orleans. So now let's get into some specifics. What are some of those Cuban musical elements that cross borders and shape the sound of jazz?
Well, one that really stands out is the cinquillo rhythm.
Cinquillo.
It's this 5-beat pattern that you find all over Cuban music, and it popped up in some pretty unexpected ways in early jazz.
5 beats. I mean, most Western music, it's in groups of like 2, 3, or 4.
Right, exactly.
So how did a 5-beat pattern make its way into jazz? Like, how did that even happen?
Well, remember those Cuban dance-on recordings we talked about?
Yeah.
The ones with that cool collective improvisation style?
Uh-huh.
A lot of those recordings prominently featured the cinquillo rhythm, especially in the clarinet and trombone parts.
So those American musicians listening to those recordings, they would have heard this unique 5-beat pattern.
Exactly.
And then they started incorporating it into their own music.
That's right. And Jelly Roll Morton, one of those pioneers of jazz piano, he openly acknowledged the influence of the cinquillo on his playing.
Really?
He even called it the Spanish tinge.
Hold on. Spanish tinge? I thought we were talking about Cuban music.
Well, you got to remember, Cuban music is this fusion of African and Spanish traditions, right?
Oh, right.
So that cinquillo rhythm, while it's deeply rooted in Cuban music, it also has those Spanish influences. And Jelly Roll Morton, being a Creole musician from New Orleans, he would have been familiar with those Spanish musical traditions as well.
Ah, I see. So it would have resonated with him on like multiple levels.
Exactly. It's like these layers upon layers of history and culture all coming together.
Yeah, that's what makes studying music so fascinating.
It really does.
It's not just like A to B. It's like this whole web of connections.
Exactly. It's about those interwoven threads, those subtle connections.
Okay, so back to the cinquillo. How did this 5-beat rhythm actually make its way into early jazz? Was it always played straight, like as a 5-beat pattern?
Not necessarily. Sometimes it was embedded within a 4-beat measure.
Oh.
Creating a syncopated effect.
Ah, that syncopation.
Right. That feeling of the music pushing and pulling against the beat.
Which is like what gives jazz its groove, right?
Exactly. So that cinquillo with its offbeat accents, it was like a secret ingredient in that recipe.
It's so cool how these little things, they can have such a big impact.
They really can.
And it wasn't just Jelly Roll Morton who was drawn to these rhythms. Our source also mentions this guy, James Reese Europe.
Oh, James Reese Europe, an amazing figure.
Yeah, wasn't he the one who led that band during World War I, the Harlem Hellfighters?
The one and only. He led the 369th Infantry Regiment Band, the Harlem Hellfighters, during World War I.
Yeah, that's right.
He was a true musical innovator. He blended ragtime, blues, and, of course, Cuban rhythms.
Really?
Oh, yeah. He was really drawn to the syncopated energy of Cuban music.
I see.
He incorporated those sounds into his arrangements and introduced them to a much wider audience.
That's incredible.
Yeah, he was a true pioneer.
So Europe's band, they were bringing those Cuban-inspired rhythms to Europe during the war.
They were. Imagine that.
Wow.
A band of African-American soldiers playing this incredible music that was infused with Cuban rhythms in the middle of World War I.
I mean, that's amazing. Talk about a cultural exchange.
It's a powerful story.
Yeah, it really is.
And it shows how music can transcend borders and even war.
Okay, so we've got the rumba, the danzon, the cinquillo, the influence of guys like Jelly Roll Morton and James Reese Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, what other fascinating aspects of this Cuban jazz connection are we going to uncover in part 3?
Well, we've explored the rhythms, but we haven't even touched on the instruments themselves.
Oh, right.
In part 3, we'll look at how specific Cuban instruments, like the clevs and timbales, made their way into jazz ensembles.
Okay.
And we'll also explore how Cuban musical forms influenced the development of big band jazz.
That's going to be good.
Get ready to dive even deeper.
All right, we'll be right back with part 3. All right, welcome back to our final deep dive into those Cuban influences on early jazz. So we've traced the journey of, those rhythms and melodies and explored those key figures, but now it's time to get into the instruments that brought these sounds to life.
I think that's my favorite part.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating how those Cuban instruments themselves, became part of that sonic landscape of jazz.
Yeah.
It's not just about taking the rhythms or the melodies, but bringing in those unique sounds of the instrument.
Right. So what were some of those instruments that made it into jazz?
Well, two of the most common ones were the claves and the timbales.
Okay, the clave.
Yeah, those wooden sticks.
Yeah.
We talked about them before.
Yeah.
They're really the rhythmic foundation of Cuban music, right?
Right.
Those crisp clicks. It's almost like a heartbeat,
Yeah.
And they found their way into jazz, and they added a whole new layer of rhythmic complexity.
So it wasn't just like keeping time, it became part of the music.
Yeah, absolutely. It became part of the melodic texture.
Wow.
And then you have the timbales.
Timbales, okay.
Yeah, those shallow metal frame drums. They've got this bright, resonant sound.
Okay.
Think of it like a fiery metallic sizzle cutting through the other instruments.
Okay.
They brought this energy, this explosive energy, to those jazz ensembles.
Okay.
A real percussive punch that was distinctly Cuban.
Wow, I can almost hear it. Were there any other instruments that made their way in?
Well, the claves and timbales were, they were the most common.
Yeah.
You'd sometimes hear instruments like the guiro.
Guido, okay.
Yeah, it's a gourd scraped with a stick,
Yeah.
and then maracas, the shaken gourds with the seeds inside.
Okay.
And those added kind of subtle layers of texture and rhythm.
Wow, so it really expanded the sound of the music.
It really did. And it's not just the instruments themselves, but also how Cuban musical forms, influenced how jazz developed.
Oh yeah, like what kinds of forms are we talking about?
Well, think back to the structure of the danzon.
The danzon, okay.
With those distinct sections
Yeah.
and that improvisation section, the trio de clarinets.
Right.
That format, with the call and response and the emphasis on improvisation,
Yeah.
that had a big impact on how big band jazz developed.
Wow, big band jazz. That seems like such a huge leap from those early New Orleans jazz bands.
It is a big leap, but, the seeds were planted way back then. Those Cuban danzon orchestras, with their mix of brass and wind and percussion,
Yeah.
they kind of provided this template for those larger jazz ensembles.
Interesting.
And those improvisational sections in the danzon,
Yeah.
they paved the way for those long solos and the back and forth improvisations.
Trading 4s and 8s and
Yeah,
stuff.
all that stuff that became a real signature of big band jazz.
Wow, so it wasn't just limited to those early days of jazz?
No, not at all.
It's amazing how those Cuban influences shaped how jazz evolved.
It really shows you how connected music is, It's like these influences, they ripple out and they affect things for generations.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered so much in this deep dive.
We have.
I mean, from the rumba to the danzon, from the skunquillo rhythm to those clavs and timbales.
Yeah.
It's really been an amazing journey. So as we wrap things up, what's the big takeaway here for our listeners?
I think the most important thing to remember is that, jazz, while we often think of it as this American art form,
Yeah.
it's really a product of cultural exchange. It's
Right.
all about that cross-pollination.
Right.
And those Cuban influences, they were essential to how the music developed.
And they still resonate today.
Oh, absolutely.
I love that.
Yeah, so next time you're listening to jazz, whether it's those early New Orleans recordings or some modern big band, listen closely.
Yeah.
Listen for those echoes of Cuba.
Yeah.
Those rhythms, those percussive accents. You might be surprised what you hear.
That's great advice. A big thank you to our expert for this incredible journey. And to our listeners, keep those ears open and keep exploring the world of music. Until next time, happy listening.